Today we are looking at a case from the mid-20th century, so sit back as we go to Malta. Malta is an archipelago in the central Mediterranean between Sicily and the North African coast. It is a beautiful country with a rich history. In 1813, Malta became a British colony and was headquarters to the British Mediterranean fleet. It was besieged by the Axis powers during World War II and was an important Allied base for operations. King George VI presented the island with the George Cross, which is awarded for acts of the greatest heroism or for most conspicuous courage in circumstances of extreme danger. In a letter to Malta's governor, Lieutenant General Sir William Dobbie, King George wrote that it was given to bear witness to the heroism and devotion of its people during the great siege they underwent in the early part of World War II. In the early 1960s, Malta was still part of the British Empire, but in 1964 became an independent republic. The largest city in Malta is Valletta, which is one of the smallest capitals in Europe. It is a close-knit community, and everyone seems to know everyone else's business. But it is also a very charming place, where for many years, people walking through the narrow streets have been very impressed by the wonderful cacophony of Baroque architecture with strong British, French and Italian influences. Tuesday the 23rd of August 1960 was a typically warm summer day in Malta. The coolness of dusk brought a welcome relief from the day's heat, and residents settled into their evening routine. Living in a small apartment off the main road in Valletta were Gigia and Lely Camilleri. They lived a quite simple existence. Gigia had 2 children from a previous relationship, Anthony, known as Twannie, who was 8 years old, and Carmen, aged 7. The couple also had their own child named Mathis, who was just 3 years old. Gigia did not go out to work. She stayed at home looking after the children, while Lely was employed as a leading marine engineer who had been working on the ship HMS Angelo. Twannie was known as both a quiet and intelligent boy. Despite his reserved nature, he loved to laugh and appeared to get along with everyone at his local school. He excelled in his classwork, always completed his homework, and was quick to answer difficult questions, usually correctly. At 7:40 p.m. on a typical Tuesday evening, a local police officer who was walking down the streets was approached by a panic-stricken man. His sobs almost drowned out what he was trying to say. "A young boy has fallen, and the man thinks he might be dead." The officer rushed to the home, climbing the winding staircase. An eerie silence enveloped him as he entered the apartment. A young boy is lying dead on the kitchen floor, in which will later be described as the most gruesome scene that officers had ever worked. The boy was identified to be 8-year-old Twannie Aquilina. His small body was curled in upon itself in a fetal position. His thin arms cradled his head, wrapped around him as if he was protecting his skull. He was surrounded by a thick pool of his own blood. Gruesomely, upon closer inspection, officers found that his head was attached to his body only by narrow shreds of flesh and sinew. His throat had been cut right through, and he was partially decapitated. Horrifically, his body was no longer warm to touch. He appeared to have been dead for some time. The boy's mother and stepfather appeared, both extremely distressed, crying and screaming by the front door of the apartment. A police investigation began immediately, and evidence was gathered from the home and the surrounding area. Meanwhile, as dawn broke, word of the murder of an innocent 8-year-old boy spread all over Malta. Local residents were outraged and disgusted that such a crime could have occurred in their peaceful neighbourhood. The spotlight soon fell upon Twannie's mother and stepfather. They were called in for questioning, and both immediately denied any involvement. Whilst Lely stated that he was out running an errand, Gigia claimed that she was playing tombola with her daughters down the road from the house, and therefore could not have been involved. As the investigation progressed, public pressure mounted to solve the case. The public could not bear the thought of an innocent child's murder going unpunished. As Malta was at the time part of the British Empire, to aid the investigation, Scotland Yard detectives were summoned in the hope of solving the case and bringing the perpetrator or perpetrators to justice. When they arrived, like most crimes, They first focused their attention on the family. They went over the statements made by Gigi and Lely Camilleri. However, they would need further evidence before they would be able to fully implicate them. Even though calm and tranquility had returned to Valletta, the residents were still horrified by the event of that August day, but they were shattered again when, as the sun was setting on the 1st of November 1960, news arrived that Twannie Aquilina's mother Gigi and his stepfather Lely had been arrested and charged with his murder. The trial began on the 25th of February 1961 and caused a sensation in Malta. The details revealed during the trial of the barbarity of the crime, and indeed Twannie's life before his death, would stand to further horrify the seemingly innocent nation. More than 100 witnesses were called by the prosecution, and a picture of the agony Twannie experienced during his 8 short years of life began to emerge. Gigi was far from the loving and grieving mother she had led the public to believe, and Lely was not just complicit, but an active participant in the pain and suffering that Twannie endured. Twannie lived a far from happy and joyful existence. Even as his mother lazed around the home, he was put to work, cleaning, scrubbing floors, hand-washing the laundry, and all with the fear of a brutal beating if he set one foot out of line or complained. In fact, he didn't even need to do anything wrong to be beaten, so commonplace was the abuse. Twannie's suffering at the hands of his mother and stepfather, those who are meant to love and nurture him most, is no better explained than in one of the stories shared during the trial. Twannie stole some change from a teacher and also from his parents. He used the change to buy himself a treat. In a moment of regret, he confessed the theft to his teacher. His teacher wasn't angry. Rather, she took it as an opportunity to teach the boy about telling the truth and repentance. Still, the teacher shared the story with Twannie's mother and stepfather, asking them not to beat him, for he had surely learned his lesson from her. But they were enraged. They tied him to a bed, beat him with a stick, and burned his skin with cigarettes. Not satisfied with his suffering, they then tied him to a balcony railing and continued to extinguish cigarettes on his skin until he passed out. It wasn't until a neighbour begged Lely to stop that Twannie was released from the railing. Teachers told of the many burns and bruises they witnessed on Twannie's skin when he was at school. He would attempt to cover them with his clothes and deny their existence when questioned. His lunch was often mouldy or not provided at all, and physically he was described as frail and slight. As part of the investigation, Twannie's body had been examined by court-appointed medical doctors to establish the cause of death. The initial examination had found that he had been killed between 5:30 and 6:30 p.m. However, help had not been sought for more than an hour after that. The second autopsy showed that alongside the partial decapitation, there were deep lacerations in the back of his skull. This had evidently been caused by a deadbolt, which had been used to beat him in the hours before his throat was slit. Whilst it's not known if Twannie was conscious during his brutal beating, doctors were able to establish that the chambers in his heart had emptied, meaning that he was still alive when his throat was cut. Handprints and pieces of Twannie's brain were found around the area where he had died, as well as in the common hallway outside his house and on the stairs leading up to his apartment. Whilst no one witnessed the life-ending attack on Twannie, the testimony of neighbours enabled investigators to piece together the likely events of that horrific day. A child who lived next door to the apartment where Twannie lived had heard him crying in the common area that day. Driven by curiosity, she sneaked out to see what was happening. She watched as Twannie fell down a few stairs before her mother grabbed her and left the building with her and her younger sister. She vividly recalled stepping over Twannie's body as he lay at the bottom of the stairs where he had fallen. The girl's mother, however, claimed that she had been out that day, although her children were home. The reliability of the mother's statement was questioned, as she had changed it on a couple of occasions. Another neighbour, this time a 14-year-old, said that when he came home and walked up the stairs towards his apartment, he saw Gigi carrying Twannie, who was not moving. He didn't really give this much attention and went out again, but when he returned home for the second time, he saw the door to the Camilleri apartment was slightly open, so peeked in. It was the early hours of the evening, and he could see Twannie lying motionless on the kitchen floor. He entered and even touched Twannie's lifeless body in an attempt to rouse him. With no response, he washed his hands and left, choosing not to tell the police officer that he encountered minutes later at the apartment block for fear of getting himself into trouble. But the most damning witness account was that of Carmen Aquilina, Twannie's own sister, who was now 8 years old. She had been watching what unfolded as she sat underneath the bench in the kitchen. She remembered that Twannie had been put to work washing the floor. He saw his father's tool set and grabbed one of the tools to repair his shoes. Gija noticed him slacking off, using tools he wasn't allowed to touch, and scolded him, snatching the tools as she did. She flew into a rage and started to beat Twannie with a leather strap. Twannie tried to escape his mother's beating and fled out of the apartment. Shortly thereafter, Carmen recalled her mother returning with Twannie, hanging limply in her arms and lying him on a bed. Carmen was then sent to fetch her stepfather from a friend's house, and when Lely returned, Gija told him that she had found Twannie dead. Gija then grabbed a bread knife, while Lely moved Twannie's body from the bed to the floor. Carmen later saw her parents change out of their clothes, putting on fresh garments, and placing their blood-stained outfits into the washing machine, along with a bedspread. Forensic evidence had shown that there were traces of what could have been blood in the drain of the washing machine. Both Lely and Gija denied any involvement in Twannie's murder. Gija stuck to her original statement that she had been away from the home for the whole afternoon. She maintained that she had only returned when Carmen, who she claimed she had sent to check up on Twannie, had been unable to find him at home. When Gija entered the kitchen, she said that she found Twannie full of blood and ran out of the house yelling and screaming, "My son is finished. He's soaked in blood." Lely asserted that he heard Gija yelling and screaming as he walked down the street. He ran to the kitchen and found Twannie in a pool of blood. When he moved Twannie's head to check on whether he was alive, he said, "It came off and I realised his neck was cut." In the end, it was Carmen's eyewitness account which convinced the jury of both Lely and Gija's guilt. The trial had taken 17 days, which at the time was the longest in Maltese history. Despite their claims of innocence, a jury had unanimously convicted both Gija and Lely of the capital murder of Anthony Twannie Aquilina. Lely was sentenced to 20 years hard labour, and Gija was sentenced to death. Merely 2 weeks later, though, Gija's lawyer successfully appealed her conviction, and her sentence was commuted to life in prison. Much to the shock of the Maltese people, she served just 10 years. The circumstances around her release have never been revealed. 33 years after being set free, Gija Camilleri gave an interview to a church newspaper. She continued to maintain her claims of innocence, saying, "How can a mother kill her son?" She is quoted as saying, "My son is a martyr, he is a saint. If you want to be granted the same grace, pray for his intercession. If I know who killed my son, I am ready to forgive him. If I do not forgive him, will I get my son back?" At the time of the interview, her home was adorned with pictures of Twannie, including pictures of him in his white communion suit. This picture of Twannie had become synonymous with the case in Malta and is still recognised by those who lived through the event. Even now, more than 60 years after this brutal murder, Twannie's case elicits deep horror in the Maltese community. In a mysterious twist, Carmen, Twannie's sister, stated in a magazine interview that everything she testified in court was a lie. She pointed the finger at a 14-year-old neighbour who claimed to have found Twannie on the kitchen floor and hadn't told the police what he had seen. To this day, no other family has ever occupied the Camilleri house, and this only contributes to keeping the case very much in the minds of the people of Valletta. Although Gija and Lely were both found guilty of the most horrific crime, there are still questions as to whether they were actually responsible for the death of 8-year-old Twannie Aquilina on the 23rd of August 1960. Hello everyone, and thank you so much for listening. As usual, please leave any comments or feedback you may have, and I hope to see you all again in the next brief case.